Mary Margaret did a great job doing a little bit of an introduction to what the prosperity gospel is. The reason that she did that is because our lecturer for the Willard this year studied the prosperity gospel. She's a Duke Divinity professor. She wrote the first history of the prosperity gospel movement from beginning to end. Her name is Kate Buller. And I imagine there's a lot of like familiarity with Kate. She's been there. Raise your hand if you're like, you've read her book or you've interacted with. So this is not going to be unfamiliar to a lot of us in the room, but Mary Margaret gave you a flavor for what she studies as an academic. And I'm going to talk just a little bit about who she is and kind of the beginning of the work that she has done that is familiar to us. And so that's where I come in. I'm going to see if I can get this to go next. Maybe not. Let's try now. No. Oh, there we go. There we go. If you want to do your own crash course on Kate Buller, here's what I suggest. You can tune me out, but you should read the New York Times article. I think it's a 2016 article called Death, the Prosperity Gospel and Me. If you have a little bit more time, you can read her first book, which is the book that we're going to talk about this morning. It's called Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I Loved, which is a line that like every preacher wishes they had written. And we're going to understand why that is her title in a little bit. You can also read a devotional. She's put out a bunch of devotionals since I've been teaching this class. There's one that I particularly like. It's called The Lives We Actually Have. And because Gerald is Gerald and super intentional and thoughtful, if you were following our devotional through Advent, Gerald wove in some Kate Buller prayers, and so you may be familiar with her style that way too. And then she also has a podcast called Everything Happens, and she has interviewed all manner of folks, and so that's a good place to start too. But who is she? She is a Duke Divinity professor. She studies history. Kate is Canadian. She grew up in Manitoba, and I'm gonna quote her because she's funny. So she grew up in what she calls the plainclothes Mennonite tradition, in which the holiest words following scripture are, "I got it on sale." Mennonites are Anabaptists. They have their roots in the the Protestant Reformation, just like we do. Mennonites are known for their commitment to pacifism and nonviolence and kind of concern over the greediness of modern society. And so she puts it this way. They have a hopeless obsession with simplicity, frugality, pacifism, and Jell-O salads. That gets you a little bit of flavor for her kind of her early life and context. She became interested in the prosperity gospel, and then she spent her 20s researching that. She went all around America. She interviewed all sorts of leaders within that movement, really to understand that. And then she wrote a book about that. And you all talked about that last week. Help me remember, what did you learn about the prosperity gospel last week? What's the kind of punchline on that? What is it? Money? Thumbs down. Kelly Graves is a thumbs down. The idea, right? That God.
Seductive. It's very seductive.
It is seductive. Yeah, it is.
Give, the more you should be blessed.
The more you give, the more you should be blessed. The stronger your faith, the wealthier you are. The stronger your faith, the healthier you are. That God wants for us health, wealth, and prosperity. And if we're faithful enough, we will receive those things. What are some problems with that?
It's not true.
It's not true. Okay, right. And scene. Thank you, Julie. Not true. What else?
Puts control in our hands.
Puts control in our hands.
It's the idea that we earn everything and it's not given to us freely.
The idea that we earn everything and it's not given to us freely. Okay. If life is going well, that means your faith is strong and God loves you and you've earned God favor. So isn't it a problem that the reverse might be true? What about this? What about the problem that faith is reduced to a formula for our own ends? We talked a little bit about formula. This is when I was like in the hallway listening for formula. That maybe that's a problem, that faith is a formula for the things that we want to get. What about this problem? And this is for like a whole nother Sunday school class. But when we start to assign virtue or lack thereof based on socioeconomic status. That's a problem, isn't it? So the poor must not be as virtuous as the wealthy. Whole separate class, but there's a lot of kind of tributaries that come from thinking this way. There's an interesting intersection. So she's studying all of this, and all was going well for Kate. She married her high school sweetheart, whom she met at church camp, like Hal, white bread and beautiful, and whatever. She had her first book published. She landed a tenure track position at Duke Divinity in like 2008, right, during the economic downturn when nobody was hiring. So everything's going well. They welcomed a healthy baby boy named Zach into the world. She loved her teaching, her life, her friendships, her academic life. And this is what she says. Married in my 20s, a baby in my 30s, I won a job at my alma mater straight out of graduate school. I felt breathless with the possibilities. Actually, it is getting harder to remember what it felt like, but I don't think it was anything as simple as pride. It was certainty, plain and simple, that God had a worthy plan for my life in which every setback would also be a step forward. I wanted God to make me good and make me faithful with just a few shining accolades along the way. Anything would do if hardships were only detours on my life's long journey. I believed God would make a way. I don't believe that anymore, is how she starts the book. And the reason she does is because when she was 35, she was diagnosed with stage 4 colon cancer, and her world kind of turned upside down at that point. When the doctor called her, all she could think to say in response to the diagnosis was, "But I have a son. But I have a son." This book, Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I Loved, is a memoir that's written in the wake of that diagnosis at 35. And so what she does in this book, and you know this if you've read it, is she combines her research on the prosperity gospel with personal stories and conversations that she has had. And it's this big wrestling with the meaning of life and faith and what we can say and not say when it comes to the goodness of God. And so that's who Kate is. She also puts a particular focus in this book on the things that people say in a time of great darkness or tragedy that are sometimes wildly unhelpful, even if they are meant with the best intentions. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. Here's what you won't find in the book. What you won't find in the book is kind of like a systematic theology in response to the prosperity gospel. So you don't get the rejection of one formula for another theological formula in this book. You are going to get an alternative to those, which I will lift up. Here's one thing that I appreciate about Kate, which I thought like maybe this is a footnote on her, but it's really not. It's the posture that she takes when she's studying the prosperity gospel. It's easy. I think we watched some videos last week that were just funny. They're funny. And they're wild. And so it's easy for us to just sort of roll our eyes about it and say, well, like, that's not us or whatever. And it's easy to kind of scoff at folks who ascribe to the prosperity gospel. But I want to share what she says. It's a longer quote. This is the last paragraph. Listen to what she says about it in the preface of her book. And I did discover that the prosperity gospel encourages people, especially its leaders, to buy private jets and multi-million-dollar homes as evidence of God's love. But I also saw the desire for escape. Believers wanted an escape from poverty, failing health, and the feeling that their lives were leaky buckets. Some people wanted Bentleys, but more wanted relief from the wounds of their past and the pain of their present. People wanted salvation from bleak medical diagnoses. They wanted to see God rescue their broken teenagers or their misfiring marriages. They wanted talismans to ward off the things that go bump in the night. They wanted a modicum of power over the things that rip their lives apart at the seams. The prosperity gospel is a theodicy, an explanation for the problem of evil. It is an answer to the questions that take our lives apart. Why do some people get healed and some don't? Why do some people leap and land on their feet while others tumble all the way down? Why do some babies die and some bitter souls live to see their great grandchildren? The prosperity gospel looks at the world as it is and promises a solution It guarantees that faith will always make a way. And this is where the slide picks up. I would love to report that what I found in the prosperity gospel was something so foreign and terrible to me that I was warned away. But what I discovered was both familiar and painfully sweet, the promise that I could curate my life, minimize my losses, and stand on my successes. And no matter how many times I rolled my eyes at the creed's outrageous certainties, I craved them just the same. There's some nodding, like, I appreciate that she sets herself not above, those folks that she's studying. She's not dismissive, but she puts herself into a posture, I think, of self-reflection, and she's able to critique her own tacit beliefs, which, by the way, we all have. And so as we live our life, when things happen, those beliefs tend to bubble up, even if we don't know we hold them. And I think that's a gracious thing that she does and admits on the front end. And that's where the book title comes from. Everything happens for a reason, and other lies I loved. They may be lies, but man, I have loved them, right? I have planned for like 3 lessons on this because I love Kate Bowler. So I don't want to get too far afield, and I want to acknowledge that we're not in a kind of vacuum. There's a lot of experience in the room. And so if you are grieving and this is difficult for you, don't feel pressure to do this. But I would love if you could just take maybe 2 or 3 minutes. You've heard a little bit about her Mennonite upbringing. You've learned a little bit about the way what happened to her at 35 intersected with the work that she did. I'm curious if you would share with your neighbor, and then we won't do it out loud as a whole, who or what has informed your own understanding or experiences of difficulty? Where have you gotten messages about these things? And what faith practices or messages have you experienced that have been harmful or helpful? Big question. I'm giving you like bite-sized chance to turn and talk for like 3 minutes. And then I know y'all all come back together. Okay. Are you too shy to do that? Everybody's looking forward. Yeah.
Front and center.
Try to get your
Front and center. Thank you, thank you. It's about 1 more minute. 1 more minute.
I usually don't try to do that when like the volume is swelling. But just for the sake of time, let's keep moving forward. But what that tells me just from standing back here is that you all have a lot to say on the topic. And that's expected and that's great. Thank you for engaging it. Second question, I'd love to just popcorn. So the title for the book is Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lives I've Loved. It plays on a common phrase of comfort offered to those in need. And I'm just curious if you could name phrases that you have heard or maybe that you've used to respond to a friend going through a hard time, something that's been maybe unhelpful but was intended for good. Throw them out.
When God closes the door, you open the window.
On my next slide, Kate Bowler says, he's so busy opening windows. Thank you. Becky,
God needed another angel in heaven.
also on the slide, horrible. What else? Someone back there?
I've got one similar. God needs some small rosebuds for his bouquet.
Wow, I can't hate that more. What horrible things. What else? What else?
What doesn't kill you makes you stronger.
Right, okay, great, yeah, thank you, thank you. As if we need those, anyway.
It's all part of God's.
All part of God's plan. What, Kelly, you were gonna say?
I've been through this too.
I've been through this too. Right. She calls that the Calamity Olympics. I'm gonna talk about that in a minute. Say it again.
Deep in your faith.
Deep in your faith. She talks about that also. Let me, here's. Everything happens for, God is writing a better story. This is it, Janice. Apparently God is also busy going around closing doors and opening windows. He cannot get enough. God has a better plan. This is a test that will make you stronger. People appeal to Romans 8:28, so scriptural. Know that those who love God, all things work together for good. At least there's a lot of at least this, at least that. And she says, I had been stripped down to the studs. And everything of worth I had accumulated was being appraised with a keen eye. And God needed an angel, in her words, because God is sadistic like that. Here's why I commend the New York Times article to you. In it, she kind of distills 3 types of life lessons that people just want to share. They feel compelled to share with her when she's 35 and sharing this diagnosis. And they're you can jump in all you want on this. This is the meat of the lesson. So she talks about 3 different folks, the minimizers, people who she calls spiritual minimizers, who tell her, I shouldn't be upset. I shouldn't be so upset because the significance of death is relative. Imagine saying that. A lot of Christians like to remind me that heaven is my true home, which makes me want to ask them if they would like to go home first. Or they might say something like, we can't always get what we want, as if chiding me, she says, for asking for dessert. Minimizers also are fond of the phrase at least. So she's at Duke when she gets this diagnosis. What might an at least be that you would throw out?
At least you're at Duke.
At least you're at Duke. Yes. Which, yes, oh, that's true. Look at those medical practitioners like right outside, but like, not particularly helpful in the moment. So at least, and then she tells this story of being on a plane. Her sister is on an airplane and she is, they get to talking with her neighbor. And she's explaining why she's going to travel with her sister because she's taking her to cancer treatments. And this woman was like, Oh my gosh, well, that's nothing in compared to what I went through as a part of the Iranian Revolution. And so she talks about the calamity Olympics, that comparison being like wildly unhelpful, because in the moment, you ask a suffering person to take on the suffering of other people, in addition to being unheard. And so there are minimizers. And just like Kate, I might add that I've been all of these people at different points, as I imagine you have too. And so let's take her graciousness into it also. Then there are the teachers. This is about pedagogical theodicy. So theodicy being an explanation for evil or suffering, pedagogical to teach. So suffering has something to teach us. And so she finds that people feel eager to help her understand that this experience she's going through is supposed to be an education in mind, body, and spirit. Listen to this quote. "I hope you have a Job experience," one man said bluntly. "I can't think of anything worse to wish on someone. God allowed Satan to rob Job of everything, including his children's lives. Do I need to lose something more to learn God's character? Sometimes I want every know-it-all to send me a note when they face the grisly specter of death, and I'll send them a poster of a koala that says, 'Hang in there.'" Finally, solutions people. I am a big solution. I'm pragmatic. I want to be helpful. This is what she says: "The hardest lessons come from the solutions people who are always just a little bit disappointed that I'm not saving myself. There is always a nutritional supplement, Bible verse, or mental process I have not adequately tried. Keep smiling. Your attitude determines your destiny," said a stranger named Jane in an email, having heard my news somewhere. And listen to this. "I was immediately worn out by the tyranny of prescriptive joy." She goes on to say that there's a trite cruelty in the logic of the perfectly certain. Those people are not simply trying to give me something, they are tallying up. This is her experience. They are tallying up the sum of my life, looking for clues, sometimes for answers for the purpose of pronouncing a verdict. But I am not on trial. To so many people, I am no longer just myself. I am a reminder of a thought that is difficult for the rational brain to accept, that the elements that constitute our bodies might fail at any moment. I'd be curious to know, minimizers, teachers, solutions, what tacit beliefs show up here, do you think? What's kind of underneath that for folks?
That we're in control of anything.
Yeah,
What do you say? I could hear.
that we're in control.
And that everything happens for a reason.
Yeah,
Or all things work out.
I'll think
You know,
about.
people say that to you, you know, like just hang in there, things are way working out.
Well, also that the person speaking knows the answer for the other person.
Yeah, right.
Nobody can dictate.
Right.
How to handle it.
What else do you hear in these?
I think there's more in scarcity versus abundance, that we're not enough as we are. And
Interesting. Scarcity, not abundance, we're not enough as we are. We should have done more to avoid living a human life. Right. Let's go Janice and then I'll come to
I
Bill.
think that there's a fear.
A fear.
I think that all of these are fear-based. It's like, if it happens to you, it can happen to me. So let me tell you, like, let me give you an explanation so that when it happens to me, I'll have an explanation.
Oh, interesting. But there's like a little bit of hedging there.
So you can take away the terrifying thought that this is real and it happens to real people.
Yeah, I'm married to an Enneagram 5 and first of all, wow. But also they believe, right, that if I understand it, I can control it.
Right.
Yeah, and maybe kind of we do too, a little bit. Bill.
So I think people want to do something.
Yeah,
They want to do something.
yes, yeah. Yeah. What else? Chuck.
I was gonna say, it challenges my belief that there is an all-powerful, all-loving God.
What challenges your belief?
The bad things that happen.
The bad things that happen,
Exactly.
right? So is there is there a defense of that all-powerful God in these responses to you, Chuck, or?
No, what it leads me to, it leads me toward atheism. It leads me toward, all this stuff I've been saying I believe about God. May be another one of those lies that love, but it's not really true.
Interesting. Yeah, like in the same way that she had to unpack some of her own understandings of how God works, and she might have spouted off one theology, but then faced with something real, all of a sudden realizing that she had an operative theology she may not have been aware of. I hear that a little in your responses. Am I off base? He's just nodding like, okay. Anything else to say here? Is there another category that you would put up here?
Well, I'm,
1, 2.
I think the other response sometimes you get is silence.
Hmm.
And that can be as harmful and painful as some of these well-intended but misdirected responses.
Silence, like in a conversation, or just like, I'm going through something and I haven't heard from you.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That like, what you're going through is too much for me to deal with, and so I'm just gonna.
It might be contagious.
Yeah.
You don't want it to be contagious, yeah. Her second New York Times article is called What to Say When You Meet the Specter or Meet the Angel of Death at a Party. And it deals a little bit with that reality of like, what does it mean to be a suffering person in the world? And like, all of a sudden you feel like you're always putting someone on the back foot, not knowing what to say. Henry, were you jumping in?
Blamers,
Blamers, kind of like cousins here a little bit.
almost like the inverse. Like
In-
you
say
did
more.
something to deserve this.
Yeah.
You didn't do something that would have averted this.
Yeah,
This won't happen to me because
right.
I don't do what you did.
I don't do what you did.
My response has been, I'm not worthy. I mean, why should I expect to receive a different type of blessing than somebody else? I'm not worthy. Not the kind of thing that I thought that I brought this on myself, but why should I expect to receive any special treatment? I'm not worthy.
Oh, it's interesting. Yeah, I've got a follow-up question.
Is, I'm sorry. Like,
Okay.
and what's just meant by I'm sorry,
Yeah.
or what does the person perceive by I'm sorry?
Yeah,
And this seems like almost a compulsive thing.
yeah. Okay,
Okay, this is positive collateral outcomes.
positive collateral outcomes, okay.
I mean, she ended up being a famous author in part because of what happened to
Yeah,
her. I was telling some folks that I fell off and broke my leg really badly and went through 5 operations and spent a year and a half on the sofa while my wife did all the work. And I learned to play the guitar. Not same song all the way.
condolences to you. Kate, remember that the prosperity gospel is about formulas. So if this, then that. If I'm good, then I get good. If I'm not, then I don't, right? She has kind of an alternative way of thinking, which I think dovetails with the way that we try to think around here, which is that instead of formulas, to think of the fact that we are all particular people who are made up of particular stories. And that's something different. This is what she says. She said such a way with words. This is the problem, I suppose, with formulas. They are generic, but there is nothing generic about human life. There is no life in general. Like if you take one thing away, there is no life in general. Each day has been a collection of trivial details like intimacies and jokes and screw ups and realizations. My problems can't be solved by those formulas or those cliches when my life was never generic to begin with. God may be universal, but I am not. I'm Tobin's wife and Zach's mom and Karen and Jerry's daughter. I am here now, bolted in time and place to the busy sounds of a blonde boy in dinosaur pajamas crashing into every piece of furniture. He, I think, was 2 or something at the time. Who's my baby? I ask him. Zach is running long loops around the room and stopping at every ledge to run his car along it. He turns to me and says, "A boy?" "Yes," I say, scooping him into my arms. He tolerates my tight hug for a few breaths and then squirms his way out laughing. "Yes," I say, "but not just any boy, you." There's something important in responding. that has to do with the relationship you have with the person. Here's an alternative to explanation or meaning making, which I think is baked into some of these things. She talks a lot about witnessing. So she says, and this is another punchline to walk away with, the basic thing is not all pain has to be explained. Not all pain has to be explained. Wish people would take a breath, notice the person in front of them and realize it's probably a hard day and maybe they just want to talk about The Bachelor. It's a good season. That might not work for everybody, but for her, if you know her, like that might work, right? You don't always have to plumb the depths, even though you're aware of the depths, I think. When Parker Palmer, who was going through a deep depression, I've said this in a sermon, I love this quote. He said this about that experience. Here's the deal. The human soul doesn't want to be advised or fixed or saved. It simply wants to be witnessed, to be seen, heard, and companioned exactly as it is. When we make that kind of deep bow to the soul of a suffering person, our respect reinforces the soul's healing resources, which are the only resources that can help the sufferer make it through. Sensitive question. Has anybody had the experience of having your soul witnessed that way? Like, what was that like for you? I think that it's interesting to think about the theology that underpins this. Here's a poem that is attributed to Saint Francis of Assisi that puts God in the posture of witness. And I'm going to read that to you. I think God might be a little prejudiced. For once he asked me to join him on a walk through this world, and we gazed into every heart on this earth. And I noticed he lingered a little bit longer before any face that was weeping and before any eyes that were laughing. And sometimes when we passed a soul in worship, God too would kneel down. I have come to learn God adores his creation. And God as witness. Got some other theologians in the room. Now I'm looking at John. I'm scared of John, but you can correct me if I'm wrong on this. But in the 20th century, there was, particularly post World War II, there was kind of a move in Protestant theology to rethink the doctrine of divine impassibility, the idea that God doesn't change or suffer. And so in a lot of 20th century theology, we hear these kind of strands of a God who suffers with, and there is an emphasis and a centralization of what it means that Jesus suffers on the cross. What does that suffering tell us about who God is? I have this giant and hard to understand quote from Bonhoeffer here. And I thought I might read it to you, but I've read a lot to you today. But one such example of that, he's writing from prison. He says, only a suffering God can help. Only a suffering God can help, not a God who's out there unmoved by what's happening in the world, but one who is very present. That's the way that he deals with what the meaning of the cross. Gregory of Nazianzus, who is an ancient guy who CJ quoted in his thing on music, this is my quote that I like to lift up, is that which he has not assumed, he has not healed. The idea that Jesus has to share our suffering in order for it to be redeemed. And then finally, William Sloane Coffin, who was a chaplain at Yale for a long time, and he was an activist also. Let me find the quote because I skipped Bonhoeffer. He was a peace activist. He lost his young adult son in a car accident. And in his eulogy for Alex, his son, he said, "My only consolation lies in knowing that it was not the will of God that Alex die, that when the waves closed over the sinking car, God's heart was the first of all of our hearts to break." That can be trite too, and I'm aware of that, but you can see the difference in that response. He then goes on to kind of call all of his minister friends to account in the way that they responded. And I'd like to read that to you. This is his sermon. He says, I mentioned the healing flood of letters. Some of the very best and easily the worst knew their Bibles better than the human condition. I know all the right biblical passages, including blessed are those who mourn and my faith is no house of rest, came from fellow reverends, a few of whom proved they knew their cards. These passages are true, I know, but the point is this. This is the Bowler point also. While the words of the Bible are true, grief renders them unreal. The reality of grief is the absence of God. My God, why hast thou forsaken me? The reality of grief is the solitude of pain, the feeling that your heart is in pieces, your mind's a blank, that there is no joy the world can give, like that it takes away. That's why immediately after such tragedy, people must come to your rescue. People who only want to hold your hand, not to quote anybody or say anything, people who simply bring food and flowers, the basics of beauty and life, people who sign letters simply your broken-hearted sister. In other words, my intense grief, I felt some of my fellow reverends, not many and none of you, thank God, he said, were using comforting words of scripture for self-protection. I think that's implicit in some of those other ones, to pretty up a situation whose bleakness they simply couldn't face. But like God himself, scripture is not around for anyone's protection, just for everyone's unending support. Reactions. I know this is heavy and hard.
I just wanted to know, you can find that eulogy online by Calvin still, because I've read it and shared it many times.
Also makes me grateful for the, for Stephen Ministry.
Yeah.
It's got a great basis, based on this. I think it, just the presence, the caring, not the curing, just sitting in this.
God is the caregiver. What is it? We're the
I
caregivers.
should know this.
I should know that for sure. Even though I might argue with hey, don't worry, God is the caregiver, right? Like that's a whole thing. Rick, did somebody raise their hand, buddy?
Sure. I'll just echo what she mentioned regarding the gift of presence.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you. What else?
Just tell people you love them. Do that.
I think it's rather presumptuous of any human being to sort of decide what God is thinking. Why, what one God can do it.
Right. There's a humility in being a theological person that is important. What else? Let me share Bowler's experience of community. And so he's talking about the power of people showing up and holding hands and not trying to explain or quote or whatever away your pain. She has this beautiful thing in her book. She says, at a time when I should have felt abandoned by God, I was not reduced to ashes. I felt like I was floating on the love and prayers of all those who hummed around me like worker bees, bringing notes and flowers and warm socks and quilts embroidered with words of encouragement. They came in like priests and mirrored back to me the face of Jesus. When they sat beside me, my hands in their hands, my own suffering began to feel like it had revealed to me the suffering of others. A world of those who, like me, are stumbling in the debris of dreams they thought they were entitled to, and plans they didn't realize they had made. That feeling stayed with me for months. In fact, I had grown so accustomed to that floating feeling that I started to panic at the prospect of losing it. St. Augustine calls it the sweetness. Thomas Aquinas called it something mystical like the prophetic life. The feeling will go. The sense of God's presence will go. There will be no lasting proof that God exists. There will be no formula for how to get it back. But they offered me this small bit of certainty, and I clung to it. When the feelings recede like the tides, they say, they will leave an imprint. I would somehow be marked by the presence of an unbidden God. It is not proof of anything, and it is nothing to boast about. It was simply a gift. So having grown up in Mennonite, 1030 Mennonite, she talks in the book about how they use we and us, like everything is a collective that they do together. And so you can see that, she's describing what happened, not just from her Mennonite family, but what happened at Duke Divinity and what happened to people that showed up in a particular way for her. So. Here, I see some Stephen ministers who've sat through this lesson before. Ron, you could take it from here. Who's familiar with the ring theory of providing compassionate care? This is it. I'm a visual learner. I think a lot of this kind of showing up thing, I can make sense of by thinking about life in concentric circles. And so this is from psychologist Susan Silk and her friend Barry Goldman, what to do in a crisis. They say, and I think this is really helpful and it feels really basic. It involves figuring out where you are in the community relative to the crisis. So here are the basic tenets, paraphrased from Silk and Goodman's article. One is to draw a circle, and in this circle, to write the name of the person at the center of the crisis. Two, to draw a larger circle on the first one, and then in this ring, put the name of the person next closest to the crisis. And then in each larger ring, put the next closest people, and then the next closest people. And then they go on to say, when you're done, you have a kvetching order. So how this ought to work. And then she says this, here are the rules. The person in the center ring can say anything they want to say to anyone, anywhere. Like, can I get an amen when you're that person? She can kvetch and complain and whine and moan and curse the heavens and say life is unfair and why me? That's the one payoff for being in the center of the ring. Okay, so and you might remember that Kate Buller talks about people who won't let their loved ones be tired. Have you read this? If you've read the book, you might remember she talks about the daughter who's making her mother put lipstick on to meet the doctor. Right? This is an alternative to that. Right? You can feel whatever you feel, right? And it's also an alternative to bright siding or being kind of calamity Olympics. You're going through this, let me tell you what I've gone through. So everyone else, this is interesting, everyone else in this order can say anything they want to about the crisis also, just not to that person, right? When you're talking to a person in a ring smaller than yours, someone who is closer to the center of the crisis, the goal is to help, to comfort, right? So listening is often more important than talking, but if you're gonna open your mouth, ask yourself what you are about to say and whether it is likely to provide comfort and support. And if it isn't, don't say it. Don't, for example, give advice. So you think about Parker Palmer. So I appreciate that. And then if you want to say something else, you dump out. So go talk to somebody who is not quite as close to the crisis if you just want to lament it. My best friend's child has cancer. He's had his whole femur replaced when he was 6. He's now 10. It's a disaster. It's awful. 2 days ago, he was in a sledding accident and fell 18 feet down an embankment and had to be like lifted up via pulley. He's waiting for hip surgery also. And like at this point, we've got this like down packed. So we've been doing it for 4 years, right? So I would not say to his mother, blah, but all of us are talking to each other about, oh my gosh, and I think that's, one way that I'm in a ring theory circle at the moment. What do you make of this? Like, is this too formulaic? She said like, formulas don't matter, but like, here's a formula, here's a strategy. I think it's a little bit helpful. You can disagree. I think that's helpful to think through.
You just have to know where you are in that circle.
Right, exactly.
You're further out than you think you are.
Further out than you think you are.
Well, and I think sometimes you're closer to the center than you want to say, because you don't want to brag and say I'm closest to the situation.
Yeah.
But sometimes you really, you don't want everybody to feel that way or nobody will reach to it.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, there's a lot of pain avoided when you kind of figure out where you are. If you're farther away, then you don't need to get in there and like make it all about you and assume the intimacy that may or may not be there. And likewise, when you're met with silence, that's a confusion, isn't it? Maybe of this, Leanna, I don't know how that hits you. You expect to hear from somebody within this circle, right?
The other thing I was gonna say that this is a little clean.
It's clean. It's way too clean. Yeah.
Like many of us are going through our own like crises of a different sort, right? And so it assumes that there's one crisis.
Yeah.
It is the crisis, right?
Right.
And that you almost have like concentric circles, because then you've also got people on the other.
You're like
end
in
of
a
the
van?
Like a Netflix.
who are sort of, you know, experiencing their own stuff,
Yeah,
right? And
right.
so that's where it gets messy sometimes when, especially if you have like a close relationship, a close friendship, and you're both going through stuff, but you don't wanna dump your stuff because of what they're going through and vice versa. And that, like, that's where it gets like tricky.
Yes.
Cause
Ask
then
me
you also
how I
don't wanna
know.
compete, right? It's not like, well, my
Right.
stuff is worse than yours,
Right.
or vice versa, right? But
Right.
you're close and you wanna
Right.
share and provide that support to each other.
Right. Thank you. Yeah, this is way too clean. And,
Yeah.
and you're
Going
right.
back to the prosperity gospel, I think that that's one of the things that's attractive about it to some people, that there are right and wrong answers.
Yeah.
Black and white. Here's do this or don't do that, you know, that this can be explained, or if you do this, then. And it's just not that clean, like you said.
Witnessing is a whole lot harder than explaining. Showing up is a whole lot harder than explaining. Yeah. Scott?
I'm just picking up on that very good point. I think one of the things that's most problematic to me about the prosperity gospel is it sort of distorts your self-awareness and always puts you at the center of your own brain, and sort of tells you that you can do things to move out of it.
Yeah.
Which I think is really harmful.
Yeah, thank you. A lot to think about. Julie?
Also, don't let being on the outside ring keep you from talking to the person in the middle. Sometimes it's the most unexpected, unknown person who can cut through all the stuff that the people who are close to you can't.
Yes.
So don't use
Thank
it as an
you.
excuse that you're on the outside.
And they're, yes, thank you. I was so hoping someone would make that point that, yeah, sometimes it can be so, you know this, Julie, right? Like to hear from somebody who may or you may not even realize are paying attention to what you're going through. Like that can be really powerful. Thank you. I have a little lump in my throat about that.
Me too.
Yeah, all the time. It's just like, this right here. What else is there to say? This is like a fire hose of what kind of Kate Buller's posture is theologically. What you are going to experience in her is that she is warm and funny and conversational, and her brain moves at a clip, and she's also deeply tender. And so I think that's amazing. I think it's amazing to have somebody who's gone through something like that to be able to share it with the world, and with a sense of humor that is not dismissing, but it's inviting other people in. So I think that what you should do on January 29th is register to come here and talk. You won't regret it. You won't regret it. You'll walk away with some nugget from that Willard lecture. So anything, like there are other Kate Bowler lovers in the room. What I miss? Are there other things to say? She's now past this acute crisis, so she's still in treatment, but this was all a decade ago now. And so she's gone on to write additional books. She's written another memoir called No Cure for Being Human, which picks up on some of the themes. And I think you will find her, I love her reading, I love her prayers and her poetry and all of that too. So go and buy the lives we actually have, and use that as a devotional.
What I love about her is it would be so easy for Kate Bowler to be triumphalist,
Yeah.
to be victorious. She's been in recession for now, for 10 years, right?
Yeah.
She's been cancer-free, which is a miracle given her initial diagnosis.
Yeah.
And so, but instead of that, she has made her mission to speak theologically and very personally into crisis in the lives of others. And that's kind of an amazing thing. You think she would distance herself from all that? She could go on the talking circuit and make millions saying, I've been healed. You know?
I've been healed, right? Yeah.
Get herself her own jet.
So I really appreciate her stance. I also greatly appreciate her love of the prayer of others. She talks about in No Cure for Being Human, being in the hospital and people anointing her with oil and people praying over her. And as you read, that, you know, that she kind of floats on those prayers. And so she really emphasizes the importance of prayer. And
Yeah.
I love that too.
Yeah, and can I admit that I think it's hard to offer to pray for somebody? Like, I'm a minister, right? I find that's difficult. And there was a woman, I've told this in a sermon, a woman in a church who, her daughter is a preaching professor that I admire, and this woman had like taken nothing but Tylenol until she was in her late 80s. And I went to visit her and she's just amazing, and I'm trying to like get out the door, you know, thanks, and because I could sense she was tired, you know? And she said, well, preacher, I guess we ought to pray. We ought to. Why don't we do that? Why don't we do that? But there's some concern that that can come across a certain way, or like, God, the preacher needs to say a prayer and say whatever. But yeah, like, get over yourself and just make the offer, right? Thank you. Thank you for engaging this. Thanks. I know this is difficult. I know it's not sort of an academic exercise for anybody in the room, myself included. And so I really appreciate your presence here, and I look forward to seeing you on, what is it, March this, I'm trying to sell this thing, March the 6th?
Thank you, March the 6th.
March the 6th.
There is a Thursday night, so it's different than we've done in the past.
Great. I'm gonna go robot.
Thank you.